Good evening. This is The Report with me, John Rees. On tonight's programme, we'll be taking a look at the case of the last British detainee in Guantanamo Bay, Shaka Amar. And we've got news of a report released today looking into British complicity in torture in Iraq. But first, a top European Union court has removed Hamas from its list of terrorist groups. Nathaniel Amos Sansom has been following developments.
A European Union court has found that Hamas should be removed from the EU's terrorist blacklist, over a decade after the group was first placed on the list. The court said that the original listing in 2001 was unsound and based on conclusions derived from the media and the internet. However, the court stressed that the ruling was based on technical grounds and was not about the question of whether Hamas was or was not a terrorist group. And the reaction from Hamas and Israeli spokespeople showed that the ruling had not changed that debate.
هذا القرار هو تصحيح لخطأ تاريخي وقع فيه الاتحاد الأوروبي بإدراج حركة حماس على قائمة المنظمات الإرهابية. حركة حماس حركة مقاومة تقاوم الاحتلال، وحقها الطبيعي أن تقاوم هذا الاحتلال بكل الشرائع الدولية والقوانين الدولية، وعلى المجتمع الدولي أن يساعدها في مقاومتها للاحتلال وليس العكس.
We believe that the Europeans agree with us and many other players in the international community that Hamas is a terrorist organization. It is the Europeans who put Hamas on the terror list in the first place. And we're hopeful that in the coming 3 months they will address and correct the procedural error.
While the ruling is very unlikely to change the relationship between Hamas and the EU, it comes as there is a growing acceptance of a Palestinian state by the international community. Today, Palestine pressed ahead with its bid for full UN recognition, despite strong opposition from the United States, which holds an effective veto as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Palestine has been an observer member of the UN for several years, and hopes UN recognition will lead to renewed negotiations about a two-state solution to the conflict. Political scientist George Cassiaman believes that the move by Palestine is only the latest step in a much longer game for legitimacy.
This is not the end of the story as far as the Palestinians are concerned. One has to keep in mind that going to the Security Council has been, from a Palestinian point of view, given their plan only as a first step. The next step would be, after that, no matter what happens in the Security Council, is to apply for membership of various councils, committees of the United Nations. And these will also not be welcomed by Israel. In fact, Israel most likely will take some steps as a form of punishment for the Palestinian Authority.
Since the recognition of Palestine in October by Sweden's government, several countries in Europe, including the United Kingdom, have held symbolic votes on Palestinian recognition, with the European Parliament conducting a similar vote today. And whilst none of these symbolic votes or rulings by themselves are changing Palestine's relations with the world, taken together, they seem to be shifting the debate about Palestine fundamentally. Nathaniel Amos Sansom, The Report.
Well, with me to discuss this is Paul Usiskin, who's a writer and commentator on Middle Eastern affairs, and Martin Linton, who's Director of Labour to Palestine. Welcome to the programme. Paul, isn't the most remarkable thing to come out of this story the fact that the EU put Hamas on the terror list in the first place on the basis of press reports and stuff on the internet?
Absolutely. It shows a level of fatal disorganisation within the EU, now finding itself hoisted on its own petard, if you like, and having to follow a procedural arrangement to remove Hamas, always with the distinct possibility that for other reasons, the more likely and justifiable ones, if you want, they'll put Hamas back on that list.
Martin, do you think that's likely, or do you think that pro-Palestinians will be able to sustain the argument put by the Hamas spokesman in our clip there, that Hamas is a legitimate resistance organisation which even under UN guidelines has the right to resist an occupation?
I certainly think that the European Court ought to be very embarrassed about the fact that they admit that the original decision was taken on the basis of looking up cases in Wikipedia or whatever. But it is a technical decision, so I think it's as well to wait for the appeal that will inevitably come and see what the final outcome is. But yes, as a matter of fact, I do agree that I think terrorist is the wrong word to use about an organization that is fighting against a military occupation. Some of the actions that Hamas have taken could be described as terrorist in the true sense of the word, actions that target civilians, but then so too could actions by the Israeli Defense Forces, who after all killed far more civilians during the recent war than Hamas did. I think the United Nations figures were 1,400 Palestinian civilians killed by Israeli action, and 5 Israeli civilians killed by action of Gazan militants. So it depends what you mean by terrorist. It tends to be a word bandied around for just apply to the other side of the argument, but it does have a technical meaning, and I don't think it's right to use the word to describe Hamas. It's individual actions that can be described as terrorist, but I don't think organizations and governments really, certainly not on the basis that they resist military occupation, because the international law gives people the right to resist military occupation, and it doesn't give them the right to resist it by terrorist means, but it gives them the right. And I think you'd have to prove a lot more before you could come to the conclusion that an organization like Hamas is itself terrorist.
Paul, do you think that at another time perhaps this decision might have been overlooked or treated with less interest, but the fact that it comes in the midst of all these parliamentary votes, at least symbolically recognising Palestine as a state, do you think it's adding to a kind of international a mood and atmosphere that's shifting in the Palestinians' direction?
Yes, and I think it's kind of exaggerated by the fact that we're in the beginnings of an Israeli general election where all of this will be examined under political microscopes at great length and for the next few months. And I think, yes, although one must recognize that symbolic nature of the recognition of Palestinian statehood by various European states, this is all going to come to a head. And it's going to be a test of world public opinion whether the world is prepared to translate symbolic recognition into real recognition at the United Nations. And on that score, we know currently Saeb Erekat, the chief negotiator for the Palestinians, has admitted in the last day or so that the PA does not have enough support around the Security Council table for the recognition that they seek.
Is that how you read it, Martin?
I think it's immensely encouraging the actions by different parliaments in different European countries to vote for the recognition of Palestine, and they're clearly ahead of their own governments in most cases. But we shouldn't get carried away, because the vote in the European Parliament today was talked about the support for recognition going hand in hand with the development of peace talks. Now, the British Parliament's decision was unconditionally that that Britain should recognise Palestine. The French Parliament's decision was equally clear, and there have been similar decisions by the Portuguese, the Luxembourgers, various others. But the Spanish vote was more confused, and the European Parliament vote was... these are organisations, the European Parliament has a large right-of-centre majority. So,
but do you think, Martin? Do you think that Paul's right that this mood won't be enough to change anything at the UN?
Well, the UN vote is very difficult to predict still, but I think at the end of the day, the Americans are going to veto the motion if they don't like it. The prize to be fought for it is not just putting the Americans in the position of having to veto the motion, so that it's clear that they are the block to progress. But there is even a possibility, I wouldn't put it any higher than this, of getting the French, German, British motion, which would be actually passed without an American veto. Inevitably, this wouldn't be as strongly worded as the Jordanian motion, which has the Palestinian support, but it would nevertheless set a 2-year time frame for negotiations on the end of occupation, and I think that would be that would be a great step forward.
Paul, you were saying that all this is kind of reacting with the Israeli general election. Just describe for us some of the ways in which that's working out. Is it helping the kind of right wing or not?
It's very difficult to say. I think what we're watching at the moment is the potential demise of the Netanyahu leadership. Here is a man who has built his career on promoting fear and paranoia amongst his people and doing it very well, so that when he hears about what happened with Hamas being removed from the terror list at the EU, his first point of default is the Holocaust. So he goes and blames the EU for forgetting about the Holocaust. That plays very well in his constituency. But the question is, what is his constituency today, and where will it be come the vote in March? There's everything to suggest that these circumstances are changing, that today what you see in Israel is a kind of growing unofficial coalition of anyone but Bibi. And that could cause a major change in how Israel formally behaves towards I seem to have lost you. Are you still there?
No, we're still with you, Paul.
Oh, okay. My screen went. It could conceivably change how Israel formally will react in the context of a vote at the United Nations for UN recognition, in the context where a new Israeli government is more likely to want to start peace talks immediately rather than put them off.
Martin, do you think that some of the change that we're seeing now in terms of the maelstrom that's happening inside Israeli politics is to do with the speed at which the settlements are growing? Because on some figures, the number of Israelis living in the illegal settlements is rising at 4 times the rate of the population of Israel within its borders.
Well, indeed, the Israelis are doing their best to populate as much as they can of the West Bank with settlements, and of course those of the settlers who are religious, they believe they're doing their patriotic duty by having between 5 and 15 children to increase the population as fast as they can. But I think that the message that is coming out now is that the rest of the world have come to the conclusion that Israel has forfeited the right to be the sole judge or even the main judge about when Palestine should get its independence, because whatever the result of the Israeli election, there's only one of the 10 Jewish parties in Israel that even supports an end to the occupation. The others are all in favor of a continuation of the occupation. So the Israeli election is not going to make any difference. It is the United Nations and the European Union especially that are the only organizations capable of resolving this dispute. And nobody any longer believes that Netanyahu should be the person to decide when the Palestinians get their independence. In other words, the rest of the world wants to go beyond Israel and take the decision back into the international arena.
Okay, so Paul, do you think that this dynamic where the illegal settlements are growing faster than the Israeli population proper, so to say, is that having an effect on the debate in the general election as you described it?
Not yet. It's too early to say. I mean, this is an election that's maybe about a week old. But some of the things that are already happening in that election tell you that despite Martin's rather dark picture of what would emerge after the election, as usual in Israeli politics, things are really not quite as they seem. For example, the ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox hold on Israeli politics is basically dismantling itself before your very eyes. And there's all the evidence of that just by going on the streets of Jerusalem and talking to Orthodox voters. The same applies to the other parties, all of whom do not want Bibi Netanyahu back in power. Now, whether that means that they all want a different perspective vis-a-vis the Palestinians, of course, that can't be said. but I think there's enough traction already in the minds of those who want to replace him, the minds of those who come from the centre and the centre-left, that recognise, exactly as Martin has described, that this situation is now out of Israel's hands. But when it comes to the final matter of a vote in the United Nations for Palestinian recognition, how do you then impose that on Israel unless there's a government of Israel ready to accept this and accept the United Nations view? Right now, you can't impose it, whatever you decide.
Okay, well, Martin Linton and Paul Usiskin, thanks very much for your contribution to that. And we should say that in a statement, the UK government has said that it will do everything it can to maintain that Hamas stays on the terror list. Okay, so we'll be following developments in that story, so do look out for updates.